Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I got another video game buyer's guide for you today. This one's gonna probably be a little longer than most videos in this series because of all the retro video game consoles, this one is probably the most unique in that it has the most options and variables in regards to collecting and product and availability and library, etc. This is like bonkers ass crazy how much stuff there is to collect for the Sega Genesis. Not just because there's like 600 plus games for the machine and at least 7 or 8 different, at the time, various hardware configurations compatible with the software, contemporary at the time, but also shit tons of options and retro clones and copycats and accessories and add-ons and upgrades and all kinds of stuff. I mean, the Sega Genesis exists in its own world. Now, obviously, full disclosure, I'm a huge Sega nerd. I love the Genesis. I got one on my 12th birthday, and it was the greatest present I ever got in my entire life. So, yes, I'm going to be a smidgen over-biased in this video, but I'm going to try to be fair because, like I've said in previous videos, I do like Nintendo. I did also have a Super Nintendo and an NES and a PlayStation and an N64, etc., etc., etc. So, yeah, I have an affinity for the Sega Genesis, but I'm going to be fair. You know, I'm not going to be like, ooh, you need a Genesis, fuck the SNES. No, come on. I've already done my video on how amazing the Super NES is, so don't come at me, please. Thank you. Alright, the Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive in third world countries that don't fucking matter to me. I'm kidding. I'm an American, goddammit. I have to have that, you know, that kind of humor. Anyways, it was also called the Mega Drive outside the US. And unlike previous consoles I've mentioned in this series that have Japanese counterparts, the Mega Drive is the Genesis. It's just it's the exact same machine, a different name. Yes, there are some video games exclusive to the European market that you can't get in the US market, but they are fully compatible with a US Sega Genesis machine. There is no region coding or blocking or anything that requires, you know, hacking or modding the machine. You could literally buy a cartridge from Europe, anywhere in Europe, and plug it into your Genesis and it'll play. Same thing with the Japanese Mega Drive games. They're fully compatible. Now, there may be language barriers, or there may be issues with the game being programmed at 25 hertz instead of, you know, 24 hertz, etc. But, this is not like a major complication. So, the Genesis worldwide, I will refer to it as, I will not be breaking down in future videos to the exclusive Japanese and European markets because they're basically the same. As in this case, almost the same as the US market. So basically there's a worldwide Sega Genesis market. It is not as blocked off as it is with the Super Famicom and the Super NES or the Famicom and the NES. This was also the beginnings of the region-free practice that would eventually become standard today. Sega was doing it before everybody else. Now, yes, full disclosure, it does require making physical modifications to the cartridge to make them fit your Sega Genesis machine, but it's a very easy modification to make. Very easy modification to make. Also, it's not that hard to get a PAL Genesis, or excuse me, Mega Drive, or a Japanese Genesis. It's not that hard to get, which again is not very necessary because Japanese software will run on a US Genesis. And you could always import games from Brazil, where they had, again, like the Master System, a robust aftermarket of Genesis product for long time. So there is that as well. Though you have other options. Now, the Genesis core hardware comes in a variety, and I mean a variety of options. You have the standard Model 1 Genesis, you have the Model 2 Genesis, and then you have the Model 3 Genesis. Those are the three base units, two of which were actually produced by Sega. The third one was produced by a third party called Jalico, but they're all basically the same, more or less. Different, like, form factor, but, like, they play the same games, they use the same controllers, they're compatible with the 32X and the Sega CD, which we're going to talk about in this video, and they're going to get their own separate videos, because it's, you know, they're worth mentioning as accessories to the Genesis, but they're also independently worth mentioning as their own individual consoles. So, we'll get there when we get there. But, on top of that, you also have hardware that was not manufactured by Sega at all, that was fully compatible with Genesis software. Most notably, you had the JVC Xi, which I believe was known as the Wonder Mega in Japan, which is more or less a standalone Sega CD unit that also has a cartridge slot to play Genesis software. So that's another option. Although that's a more expensive option, that's a way to go. In addition to that, you have the I'll just say you have the module for the, I believe, Panasonic Laser Vision unit system that you can plug into your hella expensive machine that allows you to play Genesis cartridges on said machine. There's also a Sega Genesis cartridge adapter plug-in thingamabob that plugs into your Amiga computer and lets you play Genesis software on your Amiga computer, which is another way to go. There's also, I know there's going to be a lot of alsos in this video, there's also the Sega Nomad, which is a fully standalone, independent, handheld Sega Genesis console. It has a built-in full-color screen, it has stereo speakers, it has the 6 buttons, it has, you know, battery port, but it also there is also a rechargeable battery accessory for it if you want to go that route. It has a headphone jack, it has an AC out so you can plug it into the wall. It has a DC out so you can plug it into your lighter in your car. It can be used as a handheld, or it has audio video outs that can hook up to a TV and actually be used as a home console. So, all you Nintendo nerds, the Sega Nomad was a handheld console hybrid over 20 years before the Switch came on the scene. So don't come at me with Nintendo did it first. They did not. Even the Nomad didn't do it first. The Turbo Express did it a few years earlier. So, you know, there you go. Now, moving on from that, there's also, I know, I said there's going to be a lot of there's alsos in this video. There's also another contemporary machine known as the CDX. Now, the CDX is a portable, semi-portable, I have to say, CD player. It's a fully portable CD player, as in a Discman. You can put it on your, you know, strap it to your backpack or belt or whatever, put your CDs in it, plug in the headphones, plug in the batteries, and it'll work as a CD player, just like your Discman or whatever. But it can also play Sega CD games if you hook it up to a TV or monitor. And it does have a cartridge slot, which is fully compatible with Sega Genesis software. So you can also play Genesis cartridges that way. That is all officially licensed legacy hardware that was produced at the time the Genesis was on the market. So you have way more options for authentic, original hardware than you do any other console ever released. There are no other game consoles with as many ways to play their games as there is the Sega Genesis. It's bonkers. Now, that's just Sega Genesis compatible software. A couple of those options allow the addition of Sega CD software, but you also have, if some of those options, not all of them, but some of them are fully compatible with the 32X upgrade, which adds even more software to your available library. So you can add the 34 or 35 32X games depending on which country you live in, because there were a couple of games that were exclusive to Japan and one or two games that were exclusive to the PAL market. That being said, that's not all. There is also, there is also the power-based converter, which is similar to the 32X in that it sits on top of the Genesis, plugs into the cartridge slot, and allows your Sega Genesis to play Sega Master System games. So in terms of available software, you have the roughly 250 to 300 Sega Master System games, the roughly 650 to 700 Sega Genesis games, the roughly 35 to 37 32X games, and the roughly 150 or so, give or take, Sega CD games. That's a lot of fucking 16-bit and 8-bit games for one platform. Way more software than what was available for the Super NES in any independent region. So, compared to the Super NES in North America or the Super Famicom in Japan. Now, if you merge the two libraries together, the Super Nintendo has more games, but Super Famicom games are not compatible with Super Nintendo machines. Super Nintendo games are not compatible with Super Famicom machines. They're entirely separate things. They are region locked. So that's different. The Super Famicom library is not the Super Nintendo library. They're two separate libraries. So let's get that out of the way. I'm not dismissing Nintendo. I'm just pointing out facts. Now, it is, to be fair, theoretically possible to again modify your Super Famicom cartridges to play in a Super Nintendo machine, but that's neither here nor there. But anyways, so okay, fair enough, except, yeah. Alright, let's move on. Let's get past that. I'm not taking jabs at Nintendo, I'm just trying to point out the facts. Now, on top of that, you also have retro clones. Now, most retro clones that can play Super Nintendo cartridges can also play Sega Genesis cartridges. In addition to that, there is a Super Game Boy style, power-based 32X style cartridge converter that plugs into the Super Nintendo cartridge slot that allows you to play Sega Genesis software on your actual Super Nintendo. So that's another option you can go. In addition to that, unlike Nintendo, Sega has consistently, ever since the 90s till today, re-released fully compatible retro clones of their own, or by way of third parties, that are available that can play Sega Genesis software. Again, most of them have the software built in, but a lot of them do have the cartridge port, or can be easily modified with a cartridge port, or to be loaded up with additional ROMs if you decide to go that route. So that's another option, which again is more options than than Nintendo. We're just saying. In addition to that, the vast majority of Sega-produced first-party titles from the Sega Genesis library have been re-released multiple times on modern consoles. There's compilations on the PS2, the Xbox, the GameCube, the PS3, the Xbox 360, the Wii, the Wii U, the Switch, the PS4, etc., etc. Basically, anything that can run video games that was made after the Genesis most likely can run Genesis software in some form or another. So it is very well preserved and very easily accessible. There was, for a time, a lot of Genesis ROMs available on the Nintendo Wii Virtual Console and the Wii U eShop and 3DS eShop, but those have since been shut down, so that is no longer legally an option. But, there are workarounds, if you know what you're doing. Now let's talk emulation. Again, very, very similar to the Sega Master System. The Genesis uses off-the-shelf standard hardware. And not only that, it actually has the Master System chip, the Zilog 80, the same chip that is the CPU in the Master System, is actually the sound chip in the Genesis, which itself runs on the Motorola 68000, which is one of the most common CPUs ever manufactured. It's used in everything. Calculators, watches, computers, smart devices, fucking everything uses that CPU. It's a very versatile chip. And it was used in a lot of video games too, like arcades. The Jaguar has one, the Neo Geo has one, etc. What I'm getting at is it was very thoroughly documented and robustly emulated very early on. So, as far as emulators go, you have multiple very robust and accurate and functional options on modern consoles. The Genesis is very well emulated. And the vast majority of Genesis emulators can also emulate Game Gear, Master System, Sega CD, Genesis, and 32X software. So they're very robust emulator options if you want to go that route. Like Nintendo, Sega did also produce their own Sega Genesis mini console with a collection of ROMs built in, very similar to the Super Nintendo Mini and the NES Mini that Nintendo did. So that is another option you could go. That is another route to go. The point is, if you really want to play Genesis games, it's not that fucking hard. They're basically everywhere. Basically everywhere. They're very, very easy to come by. Now, let's take a sidestep into some of the options. We've already talked about the Master System, so I don't have to tell you about the Master System power base converter, etc. It's a thing, you can do it. You can play Master System games on your Genesis, you're good to go. You also have the option of hooking up the Sega CD to your Model 1 or Model 2 Genesis, or getting one of those previously mentioned CD-ROM based units that is compatible with Sega CD software, XI, CDX, etc. Now, the Sega CD software library, we're going to get into in its own video, is a mixed bag. A significant chunk of the library is literally just Genesis ports. It's the same game that's on the Genesis, but now it has CD audio, maybe some cutscenes, maybe some additional bonus content, but it's like 85 to 95% the same game. That's not to dismiss the Sega CD versions of those games. I'm just telling you straight up, a lot of Sega CD software is identical or nearly identical to the Genesis counterpart. The 32X is going to get its own video, but there are worldwide 37 games for the 32X. A couple are exclusive to Europe, a couple are exclusive to Japan. 34 in the US. Not a lot of variety, to be honest. You know, some sports games, some 3D games, some fighting games, some arcade games, some action-adventure games, but not a ton of variety. Not a ton of variety. But a few additional options, and only like 5 or 6 games on the 32X that are also on the Genesis. Now again, the 32X versions are, in general, enhanced or upgrades to the Genesis counterpart, with the most blatantly offensive example being Mortal Kombat 2, which is barely better than the Genesis version. Barely better than the Genesis version. But you also have games like Doom and Star Wars Arcade, and some great games on the 32X. I've already done a video on my top 25 32X games. Because there's some really great, solid games on the 32X. There's some solid games on the Sega CD. I'm not sure if I did a Sega CD video yet or not, but I will eventually. So, this begs the question, who's it for today? Well, again, obviously Sega fans are going to definitely want access to the Genesis, either hardware or software library in some capacity. Probably multiple iterations. You might have 3 or 4 different hardware configurations of Genesis compatible machines. That's perfectly acceptable. There's so many configurations to choose from. Different ones have different pluses and minuses because they're not all Sega CD compatible and they're not all 32X compatible. So keep that in mind. It's also, it's pretty standard. If you're a retro gamer at all and you have an interest in the history of video games, especially the 8-bit and 16-bit era, you definitely want a Sega Genesis, or at least, again, access to the Genesis software. Because there's so many fantastic games on the Genesis you can't get anywhere else. Not just the Sega first-party stuff, but there's a ton of third-party exclusives that are locked to the Genesis or Sega CD or 32X, which we'll talk about later. Obviously, it's also for the hardcore collectors and the ones who want everything. So at the end of the day, instead of saying, oh yeah, basically anybody who collects or plays retro games should own a Genesis, I'll say basically everybody except for the diehard Nintendo exclusive crowd. If you're only interested in Nintendo product, you're probably not interested in the Genesis. But basically everybody else absolutely should have either the Genesis in their library, their collection, or some of the Genesis software in the library. I didn't even bring up Steam, which is a perfectly legal option for playing Genesis ROMs, as well as GOG.com. So, like I said, there are multiple ways to get access to Genesis software. And I love it. It's one of the greatest game consoles of all time, and it's one of my favorite game consoles of all time. Stay cool.